Hey all, Grello here. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for all of the comments in the last video. It means a lot to a noob video creator like me to receive so much feedback and encouragement, so very much thank you. In those comments, a lot of people were asking for deeper dives into various subjects, and I'm going to do my best to get to all of those, but not all in the same video. Today's video is going to focus on the borders between servers in both Ashes of Creation and Star Citizen, which, as it turns out, is a very interesting place to be. Before we get to that, quick note for anybody living under a rock, Ashes of Creation Alpha 2 is kicking off today, the day that I'm recording this, which is Friday, October 25th. I'm going to try my hand at streaming it, so we'll see how that goes. I'll probably be even worse than I am at this, but stop by if you are so inclined. Would love to have you. So in my last video, I discussed various architectures of games from 1999 until now. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. In there, I mentioned that both Star Citizen and Ashes of Creation are using server meshing to accommodate large populations of players in their game world. But they're both going about this in very different ways under the hood, and that results in them handling things like border issues and players moving from one server to another very differently. Now, I've seen a lot of videos out there that state things like Ashes has created the perfect MMO server, or Star Citizen's meshing is going to trounce everything, or why wouldn't you just use Unreal Engine 5's out-of-the-box meshing? To which I say no. It's all bullshit. There's no such thing as perfect. There's no such thing as the best. Every choice you make in software, you're optimizing for one thing at the expense of something else. It's all just a huge pile of trade-offs. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this video. Also, different people will have different levels of technical detail that they want from me, and I can't optimize for everyone. I'm going to optimize for the gamer that enjoys playing and knows a thing or two about computers, but doesn't do software for a living. This is how I approach things and break things down on a whiteboard in the office for people, you know, the PHBs, the bean counters, the product managers, all of that. And so that's what we're going to do here. Now, let's go a little further into each of these games. We're going to start with Ashes. Ashes is federating a game world across a fleet of game servers. These game servers are communicating directly with one another and collaborating on the state of the world. I would describe this as kind of a peer-to-peer game server mesh, but not all of the servers have to know about all the other servers or communicate with them directly. It's going to be concentrated around your neighbors. So like if I'm server A and server B and C are my neighbors, I'm going to be communicating with them. I'm not really going to care about X and Y and Z. The players connect directly to the game servers in Ashes. So it's going to look something like this. We're going to have a player machine talking to a game server like Zone A. And that game server is going to be loading data from a database about things in the world. As the player's doing things, it's going to be streaming events to the Zone A server. And as things in the world are changing, it's going to be streaming events back to the player. Now, as the player approaches this border, this red line representing the border between two servers here, some interesting things are going to happen, right? You got a Zone B server over here. And as it gets closer, server A is going to start communicating with Zone B. It's going to start streaming events that player one, let's call this player one, that player one is doing. So Ashes calls this a proxy. I kind of think of it as a hologram. You know, imagine we have a hologram of this player over here now because it's getting close. And it's constructed by the events that are flowing from the Zone A server to the Zone B server. So you can kind of think of it almost like a holographic projection. Now, just because a a zone server in Ashes is governing or authoritative for a particular spot of land does not mean that people in that zone can't see into the next tile. They can certainly see the terrain. Like all of the game servers are going to know about the terrain and how to render it. Even outside of the area that they're authoritative for. But what they're not going to know is like what's going on in that terrain, and that's where this peer-to-peer server communication comes into play. When Zone A server starts saying Zone B, hey, I have a player that's getting close to the border between us. Here's the information you need to start rendering it for the people attached to you, right? Because there's going to be other players attached to the Zone B server. And I'm simplifying this, but there is a litany, like a constellation of microservices that Intrepid talks about under the hood that is making this communication possible. So let's imagine that we have a player in both zones, right? So just as above, we have our Zone A server, we have our Zone B server, we have players in both. We have our player 1, we have our player 2, and we have our database. And as both servers approach this border, or both players approach this border, you get this two-way communication going, where player 1 is being projected into Zone Server B, and player 2 is also being projected into Zone Server A. So both players are free to interact with one another because it seems to them like the player is on their server. Now these are kind of lightweight objects. Again, Ashes calls them proxies. I'm referring to them as holograms. But if the ranger on Zone A is shooting player 2, the proxy on their server with arrows, this event stream from A to B is going to send that information and those happenings back to Zone B so that the Zone B server can resolve them and then communicate back to the player's machine that is attached to the Zone B server, hey, you're losing hit points. And same the other way, right? If player 2 is pelting player 1 with fireballs, they're going to know it because the information is flowing also from Zone B to Zone A and back to the player 1's machine. So this is interesting, and it also interesting. Like if this were to flip, like if player 1 were to eventually cross the line here, then all of the things related to that combat would all be taking place on Zone Server B, but it would all still be projected back to Zone Server A because everything's happening right across the border. Now you would have player 1 and player 2 both being back projected to server A so that anybody standing on server A still that hasn't crossed over yet can kind of see what's happening between player 1 and player 2. Now there's a lot of things that Ashes could do to optimize this. I'm not sure if they are or like if the way I'm describing this is accurate, but they could say, well, we're only going to do this if there's an observer around. Think of the real world. Like, have you ever heard of if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound? Like that is very applicable here. We go back to our first example, like if there's no other players around and this player is getting close to the border, it seems feasible and desirable that the system would not do anything at all. It would just let the player cross over. There would be no projections, no proxies. It would just be a smooth handoff. That would definitely be an optimization they can make. Whether they do or not, I don't know. But also kind of like reality, if anybody watches physics videos on YouTube or TV like I do, the fact that observing reality changes it. It's kind of one of those things that supports the theories of, do we live in a simulation? Well, here we go, nesting simulations. Like, if there's no observer around, the system behaves differently, so it's funny. Anyway, I find myself asking a lot of questions, like, what happens if player 1 begins weaving back and forth across the border between zone server A and zone server B? Will those borders be strict and steadfast, or will they kind of be elastic and squishy? Like if will zone server A or B kind of agree when it's time to transfer a server over? Will they allow that player to like do his weaving but not transfer authority until he's, made up his mind? Certainly edge cases, but edge cases are made to be solved. If you have somebody being a jerk and trying to break your system, like, will your system adapt and handle it without a bunch of shenanigans? I can't wait to get into the alpha today and see for myself. Let's go ahead and jump ahead to Star Citizen. Star Citizen works very differently. The universe in Star Citizen runs atop what I would call like a deep stack of layered abstractions, with each layer providing functionality to the layers above it. I'm going to draw out what this looks like here, so that we can all kind of reason about this with a kind of a picture in mind. So we have our player 1, and Star Citizen, the player will connect to not the game server, right? We have a game server, let's say game server down here. We also have, you might have heard about this, the entity graph. And we have a global database. The player doesn't connect to any of these. There's this other thing in here called the replicant. In Star Citizen, it is the replicant's job to kind of know where the player is and based on that, know what to stream to that player, right? So there's a stream between the player and the replicant here. And depending on where the player is in the world, the replicant is actually going to be streaming things out of the entity graph to the player. Now, in Star Citizen, the entity graph is the thing that stores what objects are where in the world. This is something that you don't have in Ashes or any other game that I know of. Most other games, like if a player drops something on the ground, it's very transient. I expect Ashes to work this way, but I don't know for sure. But like if a player puts something in their bank or their backpack or maybe a chest, like the game will save that and persist that so that the next time the player comes back and looks in that container or their bank, the item is there. That would be what Star Citizen calls the global database. But in most games, like if a player drops an item on the ground, like, there's something in my backpack I don't want, it's just taking up space, I just drag it out, I drop it on the ground. Some games, it just deletes automatically, like World of Warcraft, it's just instantly deleted. I know I was playing New World, and in New World, it would land on the ground, and it would stay there for a little bit of time. I think you might have like 5 minutes, but eventually it disappears. And I'm assuming that, that item that I dropped is just being stored in that game server's memory somewhere, and every once in a while it just cleans up the memory and wipes everything out that's on the ground. There's no long-term persistence. In Star Citizen, they are aiming for perpetual persistence of everything. So like if I throw my water bottle on the ground, and I'm sure you've heard of this in other Star Citizen videos, like it's going to lie there forever. So 100 years from now, some explorer will come across that place on the moon where I threw my bottle down, and they'll see my bottle lying there. The entity graph is what does that in Star Citizen. And so as players are moving through the world or universe, the replicant that they're attached to will be looking into the entity graph and kind of streaming objects that are around that player over to the client for the client to render, and so that the player can see that water bottle sitting on the ground. At the same time, the replicant needs to know which game server is responsible for those entities and the player. And it's streaming all of the things that it's streaming to the player to the game server that is responsible for those things. And so the game server is running the physics calculations, is the object or entity bouncing around, or is the wind blowing it, or, based on what the player is doing, is it causing an entity to change, So the game server is running all those types of calculations. And as it's calculating changes, it's updating the replicant with those changes, so the replicant can send that back to the player or to the entity graph or to whatever. Okay. So with all of that in mind, now we can kind of visualize what happens as we approach this border between servers in Star Citizen. And I should call out that what we're talking about right now is static. This is not a whole lot different from how Ashes is doing. We'll talk about dynamic next. But in static meshing, like, you're going to have game servers that are responsible for regions in space, and it's not really going to change. So, like, Stanton is one of the planets, or it's the solar system, right? So there'll be a server responsible for the Stanton system, and maybe servers for each of the planets in Stanton, like Microtech and Crusader and Hurston. Each of those planets may have its own server governing what's going on in that space. So say my ship here is warping through space and it's approaching Hurston, got this big planet here, and there is a server responsible for Hurston. As my ship approaches this thing and crosses this red line, so now we're in the Hurston server's territory, what happens is a whole lot of nothing. Player 1 is continuing to stream its events as I'm steering my ship or making changes. I'm continuing to stream those to the replicant layer. What happens is actually let's redraw this a little bit. It's more clear. Line. Call this game server 1. Over on this side of the line, we got game server 2. Both of these things are communicating with the replicant layer, replication layer, you might call it. And as my ship crosses this line, the thing responsible for running those physics calculations or game calculations or whatever calculations needs to run just shifts from server 1 to server 2. What player 1 is connected to does not change. The replicant layer is still in the middle of it all, but the responsibility for the calculations and maintaining the state, that responsibility, that authority has now just shifted from server 1 to server 2. So you can kind of see the difference between Ashes and Star Citizen. Now, if we kind of continue down into this scenario like we did with Ashes, so now we have a player on either side of this boundary. So we have, server 1, server 2. This is Hurston. This is the Hurston server. This is the Stanton server. My ship's approaching the line. We have player 1, player 2. We have replication layer. Sitting in between these, we have the entity, global. They really don't play a huge role here. This thing is connecting all of this. So as this ship is approaching the line, player 2 can observe it doing so, not because server 1 is telling server 2, like an Ashes, right? In this situation, server 1 would have to start sending messages to server 2 and say, hey, I got a ship approaching. That's not the case with Star Citizen. In Star Citizen, server 1 and player 1 have both continuously been sending events to the replication layer. Player 1 is saying, hey, I'm applying acceleration, and server 1 takes that acceleration and says, okay, this is where the ship is. And so all of these things are acting in coordination to make the state within the replication layer match reality. So server 2 is observing what's going on in the replication layer. So it sees from the replication layer that a ship is now within the visible range of my player, player 2. And it begins to render the player 1 ship so that the player 2 ship can see it. So this is a little bit different. This is how the replication layer is kind of simplifying this cross-boundary scenario for the Star Citizen architecture. Now, the thing that has to scale here, well, there's a lot of things that have to scale, but one thing you might have heard of recently that is having problems is the message queue. You might have heard of NMQ and RMQ. NMQ is like network message queue, I believe it stands for, and that's what was responsible for moving messages between these servers and this replication layer, and probably the clients as well. In the recent server meshing test, NMQ is what was falling over or getting congested and not scaling. It was failing, and as a result, like, all the players were seeing super jank, super lag. You know, you do something, it takes 10 minutes for it to actually reflect in the world. That was because of this issue where the message processing was getting massively delayed because of congestion within the thing that actually moved this information between your game servers and your replication layer. So we'll see. I just working on now is RMQ, stands for replication message queue, with the goal of increasing the bandwidth, increasing the performance so that we can drastically scale up the number of messages that can travel between our game servers and our replication layer and our players and all of that. This is normal software engineering, right? We run into limitations, we redesign it, we rebuild it, we refactor it. So there's nothing surprising going on here. But I just wanted to relate what you might be hearing in the news to this diagram. I mentioned the global database briefly. You know, we know what the entity graph is responsible for in this. The global database is going to be responsible in Star Citizen for things like market data, you know, player wallets, like what standing you have with a faction. Those are the kind of things that would go in the global database. Also stowed ships. So like if you log out, like if my ship's floating in space and I log out, like my ship's going to go to the global database. It's going to be kind of stored and it will no longer be in the entity graph. So if player 2 is now flying through space, they're not going to see my ship because it's stowed. Okay. Let's talk about dynamic. So everything I've talked about so far is mostly how static server meshing in Star Citizen is going to work. Once dynamic server meshing ships, what's going to change is the way that authority is assigned. I believe the name of the server or the service that's going to be helping with this is called Atlas. And Atlas is going to be observing kind of what's going on in the universe, where we need more compute or processing power, and it's going to begin assigning game servers to govern resources not by geography but by demand for computing power. So it may decide that, you know, this ship here is in need of enough resources. Say we have 200 players on the ship. It assigns game server 3 to govern what's going on this ship. And so now You know, we have all these people on the ship. They're running around the corridors. Game server 3 is handling all that. Now let's say this ship is flying through the Hurston atmosphere. Hurston still has game server 2 dedicated to it. Down here is the surface of Hurston. Our ship is flying through the atmosphere. Let's say there's a conflict down here. Maybe we have a tank and some soldiers over here, and they're shooting at each other, and there's just a whole bunch of stuff going on down on the surface, right? So now we're in a situation where we have a server responsible for Hurston. It's running all the calculations for that battle happening below our ship here. We have 200 people on this ship on game server 3 flying overhead of this battle. And all of this kind of works in unison. So the way all of this information is going to get disseminated is that the replication layer, so server 2 is resolving the battle. There's missiles and rockets and stuff landing. And it's updating the state in the replication layer. As our ship flies overhead, the location of the players on that ship is being updated. So, and they're connected directly to the replication layer too. So the replication layer knows where those players are. It begins streaming to the client machines all the state of this battle below. It's also streaming the state of that battle below to the game server that our ship is running on. And so it's kind of impressive if you think about it, that we could have all of these servers, all these game servers involved in processing all of this, all these goings-ons, all these players connected and in all these different ways, but all of this information is streamed to all of the clients in the way that everybody is kind of seeing the same state of the universe. So just to recap, the Hurston server is processing what's going on in this battle. It is streaming that to the replication layer. The replication layer knows that the players on this ship are close enough to see all this going on. They're streaming, so the replication layer is streaming all of that information to these players. It also knows that essentially this game server 3 that is hosting the ship is in proximity, that it needs to know some of these things. Maybe a stray missile, is interacting with our ship in some way. So game server 3 needs to be able to be aware of what's going on there, running the proper calculations. So the replication layer is the key, and that message queue system, RMQ, is the thing that must scale to handle all of this. Now there's still going to be limits here. In my comments, I heard somebody talking about like million-player battles. One of the ways to scale this up is like just throwing more and more game servers in a region, kind of like Ashes. I didn't get into this today, but I got into the last video. Like Ashes, if you have a bunch of players flooding into a zone, it'll begin to subdivide that zone into multiple servers so that you have more and more servers collaborating on a battle. But Ashes has limits on how small it can make those, because as you introduce more and more servers, you're going to increase the overhead of the communication between all those servers. This is not going to be super different. I think this will scale better, but you're still going to, if the servers, like say you have an area of a moon represented by this square, and more people are flooding into this area as part of some war, and you got ships flying overhead and all of that. Even if you start throwing more and more game servers at this, and the dynamic authority system that Atlas will introduce, even if it can start load balancing all of these people between all of these game servers, the area that the activity is happening in is small enough that there's enough state changes happening that impact everybody in the area, that as you add more and more game servers, you're going to be multiplying the amount of data that has to transit the network, because all of the servers are going to kind of be interested in all of the things that are going on in that area, right? So reaching 1 million players in a small area, I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. I think, I don't know, there could be some super huge breakthrough that I'm not able to model mentally that would allow it, but I don't think it's going to happen on this technology alone. But I do think that the ability to dynamically partition players across game servers, even in a small area, will allow us to scale farther than we've seen to date. And I think it is going to allow some very high fidelity, very large battles. I just don't think it's going to be 1 million. Okay. Maybe a couple other things that are worth talking about on this borderline. Let's imagine, let's clean this up a little bit. Let's imagine that kind of like an Ashes, I talked about some optimizations that can be made. I'm sure there's a bunch that will be made here, but imagine that this ship fires a missile. It's on this game server. This ship's on this game server, and ship 1 fires a missile at ship 2. What's going to happen is, first of all, the fact that the missile was fired is going to be streamed to the replication layer. The game server is going to see that this missile was fired. It's going to know and it's going to start running the calculations of the velocity and the heading of this missile, and it's going to begin updating the position of the missile in the replication layer, and that's going to be streamed out to all the clients so that everybody can kind of see this missile moving. When this missile crosses the border, game server 2 is now going to take over running the calculations for that missile, and it's going to be updating the replication layer. So server 1 is no longer responsible. It's like, oh, it crossed, I don't need to worry about it anymore. Server 2 is going to handle the rest, and eventually it's going to impact the ship over here. Contrast that with a bullet. Somebody asked me about this. Imagine we're not in space. Imagine we are back on the surface of Hurston, and we have a player on this side and a player on this side, and they're firing guns at one another. I would doubt that it's going to work the same way. I don't think that game server 1 is going to be calculating positions of a bullet and updating that position in the replication layer. That would be a ton of overhead, especially when you consider how many bullets you can fire a minute. It's a lot. I think in these kinds of situations, what will happen is game server 1 will just calculate the hit against the player on game server 2. It'll write that to the replication layer. Game server 2 will see that a hit was registered against the player on it, and it'll resolve it. That's how I see that working. So instead of like kind of phases of a missile, like as it carries through its trajectory, I think it'll just be fire, hit, run the calculation, resolve it. And if there is any kind of visuals associated with that bullet flying through the air, I think that'll be handled client side. Okay, that was a lot. Let's compare and contrast. I mentioned at the start that everything in software engineering is a trade-off. So let's talk about a few. And right off the top, I will say that as an outsider, of course, I've never been associated with these teams. I never talked to these devs. But I think, just on my observations, that both studios are making the best decisions for their games, respectively. Some things I'll note is Star Citizen is action combat. Ashes is hybrid. I think it leans more towards like the tab targeting, like target and act style of combat. This means that Ashes is going to place a much lower load on the game server per player than Star Citizen will. Action combat is just more intensive. There's a whole lot more for the server to be tracking and calculating and etc. Also, the Ashes world is a lot more reasonable in size. It's huge, it's enormous, but it's going to be the size that you can fit on every game server if you need to. Whereas Star Citizen, the sheer size and scope of the universe, I don't know that you can make that assumption. The scale is just crazy. And so these are the reasons I think like it makes sense, the architecture and design that each of these teams is choosing. When it comes to trade-offs, I think that Ashes is going to be easier for them to deliver a performant, stable, in-tile experience than it will be for Star Citizen. Because if everybody is in a tile, it's going to be a very traditional game server, right? They're pushing the complexity to the edge. Ashes is not doing anything crazy until your players get to the very edge. And you have to ask yourself, like, what percentage of gameplay is that? Like, if 90% of gameplay is happening in tile, then it's really not a large percentage of the things that are going on that have to run through the extra complexity of their projection and proxy system. So I think that's a really good trade-off for them to make. Ash or Star Citizen, on the other hand, they're absorbing the complexity all up front. In order for anything to work well at all, everything has to work well. That is a huge ask, right? And I think that there's benefits to that. The benefits are like everything works consistently. Like in Star Citizen, as you've seen, as we've kind of gone through this, it doesn't matter if you're playing in tile, if you're playing near an edge or right on an edge, everything works the same. Your client is talking to the replication layer. It's not aware that it's like the client is completely oblivious to the fact that it's transferring servers. Whereas in Ashes, the client will literally physically change which server it's connected to. In Star Citizens, that's not the case. You'll be able to traverse 10 different servers without ever changing the replicant that your client is connected to. It's all kind of happening behind the scenes. So this means everything's going to happen consistently. You'll scale consistently. And, you know, like I said, given the sheer size of the universe that Star Citizen is creating, I think like taking this complexity on up front and solving it up front so that everything else kind of works consistently, I think it makes a lot of sense. Especially if you take into account Star Citizen's persistence goals. That's something I touched on briefly. Like Ashes of Creation, to my knowledge, was not taking on, you know, throwing a sword on the ground and seeing it a year later. This is something very specific to Star Citizen. I think so, especially if you factor that in, the way they're tackling entity authority and entity ownership and state replication. I think it makes a ton of sense, and I actually don't know that what the goals that they have, I don't know that they would be possible any other way. So there we go. There's another video. I hope it was as useful or as informative as the last one. I hope this was the right amount of depth for playing at the edge or the boundary between two servers in these games. Like I said earlier, I'm super pumped to see this for myself in Ashes today. I'm gonna start streaming here in just a few minutes probably, and you can best believe that I'll be one of the jerks on the border, weaving back and forth or jumping from one to the other and seeing what I can determine. And I will certainly come back and give some updates based on what I've observed there. And so I'm gonna call it there and go play. Don't forget, unhinged.gg, go visit it now, follow the links to Discord, hop in. I would love to talk more with you there. We have a gaming community that is investing heavily in Ashes of Creation, Star Citizen, and PAX Day. Those are our three. That's our trifecta. So we would love to have you. Unhinged.gg. Hope to see you there. All right. Thanks all. See you in the next one.